Hello, welcome. We're going to be looking at, in this video, we're going to be looking at Australian language and Australian texts. And what we're going to be looking at specifically is we're going to be basically identifying how Australian texts are written and how to go about interpreting different aspects of Australian texts. Now, we're not going to go so much into the various colloquialisms of Australian speaking, and certainly we're not going to go step by step through every single one of them because there's way too many and there's not enough time. But we're going to basically analyse the way in which Australian texts do speak and how they use that to basically represent Australian culture and represent the Australian way of life. And basically, as with any other nation or community, Australians have their own style of language and culture, which is difficult for those unfamiliar with it. So it's something that is very, very specific to us. And even if you were to give an Australian story to another English speaker from somewhere else, they would have a lot of trouble understanding different aspects of it for that reason, because a lot of it is Australian specific, as is a lot of other texts. And unless you have a familiarity with England or Britain or America when you read respective texts from those nations, there are going to be some aspects of it which will become sort of lost on you unless you know a little bit about them. Now, because of the fact that Australians absorb so much of British and American culture, it is relatively simple for us to be able to interpret those cultures. But if you're looking at it outside, and particularly from an Australian perspective, okay, a lot of aspects of Australian culture don't really travel that well overseas, and so it's one of the really interesting things, I guess, when you're speaking about Australian texts, is to sort of note about how they're so difficult for other people to understand. And in many cases, they are dubbed in other nations because nobody knows what on earth we're talking about. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at quite deeply in Australian texts as well and give an example. Okay, so what's different about Australia? Well, first of all, Australia's culture has shifted, and the culture itself has shifted. So what was once a European-dominated society is now very much a multicultural mix. And so what Australia was 30 years ago, even 50 years ago, is vastly different to what it is now. So in terms of understanding Australian texts, you need to understand the fact that basically in the last sort of 50 years or so, Australian texts have become completely foreign to what they once were. And if you were to say basically 50 years ago that Australia is like what it is now, many people probably would have shook their heads or laughed or something along those lines. And that's not necessarily because of, I guess, the inherent racism that came with things like the White Australia policy, but because of essentially the idea that Australia has become so different and has become quite a unique nation among others in the world. The colloquialism. Now, obviously, language of Australia is not universal and reflects a unique sense of identity. So the way that Australians speak, the way that anyone really talks, particularly informally, is going to reflect the Australian identity quite closely. And certainly a lot of texts that you'll be reading, you'll have to make an effort yourself to understand what some of the colloquialisms are about. And that usually just requires a quick Google search. So it's not massively intensive. And anytime you get stuck, that's all you have to do. And you'll usually be able to find what's referring to. And finally, community. Australia is divided by distinct cultural communities, which also must be looked at. So even if you'll say white Anglo-Australia, there are a number of different categories of that. They're divided by class, they're divided by where they live, they're divided by what sport they support, and where exactly their sort of parents come from. So even that has a huge area, a point of difference, and certainly people living in even similar neighbourhoods have completely different ideas of what community is, and certainly ideas of values and beliefs as well. Okay, so you might be wondering, okay, why do I need to know this? What does this mean to me? Well, text in context relates to how texts display identity through their contexts. So if you're asked to talk about their identity, particularly if you're asked to talk about something like belonging, for instance, then you're going to find belonging through this context, as in understanding how a particular author or a particular subject fits into the overall scope of what Australian culture is. And certainly if you're thinking about belonging to place, well, you've got to basically identify what the conflict is between their point of view, their values, their way of life, and what those of around them are. So if one person is completely foreign to their community, and yet us part of that community, okay, then you're going to see basically identity being lost through that. Whereas if you find a number of people sort of joined by the same sort of thing, then I guess you get identity out of that. You find identity through how language and cultural references are incorporated into the text, as in essentially what parts of Australiana are thrown in there. So what they refer to, what aspects of Australian life are referred to in the story, whether they refer to Australian media, Australian pop culture, whether they refer to Australian sport, any of those things are frequently incorporated, and certainly do also speak quite a bit about Australia's identity as well. Now, often these are distinguished by a couple of things. First of all, the time the text was written. Okay, so if you're looking at the 1880s, roughly about around Lawson's and Patterson's time, okay, Australia's sporting history is non-existent at that point, because Australia doesn't really have that many national sporting teams at that point, and very few of them have travelled outside of Australia. So in terms of time of composition, it has a huge influence on that. The setting, as in if it's set in the city or if it's set in the bush, a lot of that will have to do with essentially how you look at it, and certainly you won't be telling the same stories in the city as you will be in the bush. And finally, the cultural background of the composer, and whether or not they were born in Australia, whether they immigrated to Australia, whether they feel like they're actually from Australia. All of these things are quite important as well. So in terms of actually understanding what a text is going on about, you need to know these things. You need to know bits and pieces about all of these aspects and how they are influential on the text. It's the only way to be able to understand it. And if you find yourself struggling to comprehend what's going on in the text, it might be an idea to have a look around at these things and do a little bit of research. Okay, so let's look at an example of Australian context in action and how it influences a text. And we're going to look at Rob Sitch's comedy The Castle, which, if you're lucky enough to be doing this for your HSC, well, you're in luck, because we're going to go quite through how it relates to text and culture. Now, it represents this through vernacular, visuals, and content. And basically, all those things together represent Australia in terms of its context. All right, so let's look at basically briefly how, and we're going to identify how context and text are linked together, and how we basically see that this film is an Australian film and it fits in with the Australian landscape. Okay, well, first of all, it's a portrait of a white, low middle class Australian family. Okay, so the family is clearly an Australian family. It is, as I said, low middle class. It identifies as being Australian. It's always the first main challenge. It's white Anglo. It's a nation. It's a family that fits the sort of I guess cultural paradigms as a nation. One who have meat and veg for dinner and all these sorts of very Australian things. I'm not going to list them all, but there are a number of different things that make them quite distinctly Australian. They're framed within the moniker, the Australian moniker, "A Man's Home is His Castle." I mean, that's the title of the film, and it's also a predominant theme throughout the text. So this idea, this Australian ideal that man's home is his castle, is very much linked within the main subject matter, the main theme of the film. There are many examples of Australian vernacular. Okay, the language there is quite distinctly Australian and represents the Australian way of speaking, as in it's not speaking in any other voice other than an Australian one. And it's one that a lot of Australians, particularly white Australians, can identify with. Okay, it represents the mid-90s in Australia, the time it was filmed. Okay, so it's not, I mean, it was made 16, 17 years ago now. So it is a film which basically represents a different time period, and certainly there are a number of things which you would look at in this film which aren't really that current now. And there are some things which are still sort of carrying on. So even though this is a family in Melbourne in the 1990s, there are a number of differences. Even now, I mean, it's only been 20 years, but it's still a huge jump. Okay, it makes a number of references to mid-90s events, so it's very much entrenched into that time period when it was composed. It refers to television shows that are on at the time. It refers to the trading post quite frequently, which are now, is now online, but it used to be in the paper format. And it makes basically a reference to 90s Australian life. And finally, it represents the laconic Australian attitude, as in it's very laid back, it's very much takes the you-know-what out of itself. So all those things together are basically the ways in which it tries to link with this Australian context. Now, in terms of the context, it captures the lifestyle of many lower middle-class Australian lifestyles, as in it resents the upper class, it desires very simple pleasures, they're very happy just being in their own home, and is a patriarchal lead, as in it's a family, it's a father-first family. And again, it's one of those things that the film does quite well. It captures that, identity of Australia, and it captures a huge part of the Australian audience. There's a number of references to contextual events, such as the Mabo Aboriginal rights case, which is referred to in the film, but there are a number of other references which I've mentioned before as well. So again, it's quite linked within its context. It doesn't really exist in isolation. It's something that takes, the current world, the current events of the world, and imposes them onto the film. So it's not something filmed in isolation. And finally, it represents the Anglo-Australian communities distinct and removed from the world, as in they are ones who don't really bother themselves with global events. And certainly it sort of represents, a little bit about Australian life at the time. And probably one of the ways Australian life has changed a lot in the last sort of 15, 20 years, and that Australia is becoming a lot more connected to the world through technology and through its desire to be part of, the global conversation in order to be recognised, to be noticed. So there are a number of things which are very inherent to that context, and which is the reason why the film was so successful, because it basically connected with so many people within that context. And so between what the text presents and what the context is, we can see some very clear connections, and ones that obviously resonate with the audience at the time. So in conclusion, what can we say about it? Well, first of all, we can say that the text reflects the Australian way of life and the dream of owning one's home, or to be able to live in one's home. So a place to call their own, and that's certainly something which, particularly at the time, I know it's something, again, that's probably losing its luster as it existed then, but it's something that was quite important to a lot of Australian families, that they had their own home and they had somewhere that they could call their own. It reflects the identity of the lower middle class Australian family and their lifestyle. So again, it's a film that basically is a portrait of lower middle class Australia. And finally, this influences our perception of each character, the mannerisms, and the overall theme. So this is where, our interpretation comes into it. This bit in bold here. So it influences our perception of each character. So we're identifying them as Australian, we're identifying them as almost to the point of stereotypically Australian. Their mannerisms, so we're looking at in terms of their colloquialisms, their way of being, their laconicness, all the rest, and the overall theme, how it actually connects to, Australian identity and the Australian way of life. All those things together are things that we can draw, and that's purely through just the analysis of text and context. And these are very important points that you'll need to be able to discuss and develop as you're writing about a text, and particularly by also understanding it as well, because if you can understand how this fits into what an Australian family was like at the time, then you're halfway to getting a lot of the references in the film if you're not quite familiar with them. So if you're not familiar with some of the references in the film, it might be an idea to just go and find out a little bit about what Australia was like in the 1990s, learn a bit more about the film and what it represents, and then you'll start to find it's a lot easier to be able to interpret it, and certainly becomes a lot less complex. I mean, it's not a complex film to begin with, but it becomes a lot less complex once you've done that. Okay, so in summary, Australian texts are influenced by culture. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but it is. And certainly, whenever you look at an Australian text, you've also got to think about how it fits into the Australian landscape, as you would with any other text. It includes time, setting, and background. So the time it was written, the setting of it, and its background. And finally, how you can critique how these ideas of time, setting, and background are incorporated. So essentially how the author's style, how the the setting of the story, and how all those things are incorporated into the layout of the story and how it influences their style of writing. Otherwise, that's it for Australian text and language. Until next time, I'll see you later.